Welcome to the Regulation Podcast from the Institute of Regulation. My name is Marcial Boo, Chair of the Institute and a regulator myself. This podcast focuses on one tool that all regulators use to ensure compliance with the rules. Yet it's not the tool that we usually first think about when considering how to be an effective regulator. I'm talking about communications, how we tell our regulated community what the rules are, why the rules are important, and how to comply with them, and what happens when they don't. Without good communications, you could argue that good regulation itself isn't possible. I think that's the case based on my own experience at different regulators. But I'd be interested to know whether our guests here agree. And with us to discuss the importance of communications to regulators and how comms tools can be used, we have two experts in the field. Stephen Hardwick is an experienced communications director and consultant who's worked in government and regulation for over 30 years, including at HM Revenue and Customs and the Equality and Human Rights Commission, as well as in regulated international businesses too. Stephen, welcome.
Hello.
And Anne Shevas has spent her working life in communications too. First as a reporter, then as a government press officer, working closely with two Secretaries of State, the First Minister of Scotland, as well as in Downing Street with both John Major and under Tony Blair with Alistair Campbell. She's headed the HMRC press office and advised many national charities on communications as well. It's good to have you here too, Anne.
Hello. Hi.
Hi. Right. Now then, introductions over. Let's start by setting out what we mean by communications in a regulatory context. It's not just about issuing a press notice and a bit of internal comms. So how can regulators use comms to inform people about the rules and help people to comply? That's the key question. In other words, what role does comms play to support good regulation? Stephen, let's start with you.
Okay, well, let's start with first principle. Let's strip it right back to the four levers of government. The four things that government has at its disposal to get people to do things or not to do things. First is legislation, setting the law. Second is regulation, enforcing those laws. The third is taxation, raising the money to pay for government. And the fourth, final and integral one that weaves across all of them is communication, because if you don't tell people what the laws are or what their obligations and rights and duties are, then you're not going to be able to run an effective government or regulation. The role of comms within regulation, as it is with government, is really fourfold. First, it's to inform. You've got to tell people what their duties and responsibilities are and let them know when things are changing. The second is to explain so that people understand how to comply and when to comply. Third is behaviour change, because really what government is about is getting people and organisations to do things that you want them to do and to stop doing things that you don't want them to do. And communication is a really high impact and low cost way of persuading people and organisations to change their behaviour in the way that you want to. And the last one is reputation. And this isn't about the reputation of an organisation so that people just like it. It's about having the confidence in an organisation's fairness, in its integrity, and its competence. Because if you have a regulator that people don't believe in, then you're going to find it very hard to get that people to comply with that regulator and what it asks you to do. So reputation of an organisation is really, really critical, and communications plays a big part in helping that. But to do this, in terms of what comms actually does, is helps organisations to communicate with a varied range of different audiences and through a varied range of different channels that they have at their disposal. Internally with staff or externally through a wide range of direct and indirect routes. And those can be active, proactive, and they can be passive. So passive comms is about putting information out there that people can access if they choose to. Generally, you'll stick stuff on your website, but you rely on people coming to you to look this information up. It is very much complying with legal obligations to provide information, but without making a huge amount of effort to get people to engage with it. And active comms is the flip side of that. It's going out to reach for your target audiences with tailored messages to reach the right people with the right messages through the right channels at the right time, through all the different routes, so that the people who you're trying to engage with know what it is they need to do and when they need to do it. Really important, though, is that communication is integral to everything that a regulator and government does. It's not just the responsibility of the communications team. Most of what people in public office are doing, whether officials or ministers, is communicating. Yeah. So it is a responsibility that goes right the way through an organization. What the comms team does is brings professional discipline to support the rest of the organization to do one of those 4 key levers of government activities by being really good at engaging and understanding how and when to engage with those audiences. So comms is a fulcrum, but it's not the only mechanism as a comms team, is not the only mechanism for engaging as a regulator or as government.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so that's a fantastic tour of the whole communications landscape, and you've put comms right at the very heart of what regulators do, and you've set out a number of detailed things which we're going to come back to in a moment. So, Anne, just listening to Stephen then and hearing what he said, do you agree with that formulation of comms right at the heart of what regulation's about?
Very much so. I mean, it's taken quite a long time for comms to reach that, to reach the central role that it actually has in any organisation. I think 30 years ago, you wouldn't have heard a former director of communications saying what Stephen just said, because comms was seen as a very much of an add-on to any organisation. And now I think there is much more acknowledgement of the importance of getting things right, because if you want people to do something, then really you do have a duty to explain to people what they need to do. And don't assume that everybody knows what to do. I think that's a complete failure in any organisation when people say, oh, no, you don't need to worry about that. Everyone knows. Well, I'm afraid everyone doesn't know. And so clearly the main thing would be to make sure that people do know and target your audiences properly to make sure that the right people are receiving the right messages. I mean, most people, I think we'll get onto this later, but most people, I think, are quite law-abiding and want to follow the rules. And there'll be some people at the other end of the spectrum who certainly don't. And so if you're an organisation, like my previous organisation, HMRC, there was quite complicated ways of getting out the message to helping people do what they have to do, and also to get to the people who were determined not to do what they wanted to do. So the comms team does have a central role. They have to be able to translate some of the technical detail that's obviously involved with regulation to make it accessible for people to do what they should be doing.
Good. Okay, well, this is fantastic because we're all focusing on the importance of communication. So let's dive into a little bit more detail now. And I'm thinking about the kinds of questions that regulators should ask themselves when they're thinking about how to use communications as a regulatory tool. So Anne, just coming back to you first, what are the first things that a regulator should think about if they want to use comms effectively?
Well, it might sound counterintuitive, but they should actually think about what could go wrong and plan for any sort of crisis. Because if you can deal with the crisis effectively, that will affect, the reputation of your organisation. And believe me, every organisation will face a crisis at some point. So I would say that think about what could go wrong and plan to make sure that you've got a system in place where people can talk to individuals who know what's going on in the organisation, make sure that you do have a comms team that's available 24/7, set up a process of clearing lines. And because the thing is, if you don't react quickly when there's a problem, I'm afraid there's a vacuum, and there's nothing that the media like more than a vacuum, and they will fill it. The problem now is that, of course, that there's no time for people to perhaps pull a line together and react because the speed of media these days is it's phenomenal. I mean,
Yeah.
it's quite extraordinary how quickly things go.
Well, minutes, isn't it?
But and also people shouldn't say, "Oh, that will never happen," because believe me, the most ridiculous things happen. And the minute somebody says, "No, we don't need to answer that question," because nobody will ever ask it, they really aren't thinking straight, I don't think. But I think if you are in the situation in a crisis, then for goodness sake, don't make it up. Be honest in terms of you don't know. So it's better to say you don't know than make something up that proves to be wrong later on. And also react to questions with, even if you can't actually make a comment, try and get a holding line together so that you can actually keep people at bay, that your name is in there, that you're looking concerned, not just looking concerned, you're looking active and trying to deal with the problem. If you can deal with a crisis, I think you can actually, that shows that you've got a working comms team and that you can plan for the day-to-day as well.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I mean, everybody in a regulator listening to this will know that regulators can be in the firing line from time to time, and we've had stories about different regulators over the last few months, indeed. And yes, so you're counselling that comms teams, organisations as a whole, should have good links internally ahead of that, so that you're ready to deal with the crisis when they happen. Stephen, thinking about this kind of stuff, getting ready for comms, using comms effectively, what's your advice to regulators?
Well, Anne's quite right that you have to plan for when things go wrong. But you also have to plan for things going right. And so what we developed in Whitehall across government, that all government communications teams and regulatory teams and local government also use is a campaigning tool which helps you plan what you need to do for communicators. But it always starts, and everything should always start with the business objective. So the question for the organisation is, what are you trying to achieve? What is the outcome you're seeking to achieve? So what's the objective you're setting that will produce the outcome that you're looking for? And it's about business outcomes. So for communications, it's understanding what the business outcomes are to which communications can contribute and support the delivery of. It's not about what are the communications objectives in terms of the volume of activity that looks like you're doing something, but in fact all you're doing is sending stuff out into the ether. Anne will probably remember we used to get from time to time teams coming to us saying, "Oh, we need a poster campaign to support their activity," and we'd say to them, "Well, what are you trying to achieve?" "Well, it doesn't matter about that. What we need is we want posters in bus stops and this, that, and the other," because what they wanted was the perception of activity by the organisation, but without explaining what they were trying to do. And we'd always say no. We were the people who said no, but constructively, because we'd say, tell us what you're trying to achieve, what your objectives are, who are your audiences. So that's the second point, objectives, then your audiences. What do you know about those audiences so that we can understand who and where they are and how to target them? Then we put a strategy together that put together the objectives of the audience and the channels that we might use and the messages that we'd use, which we then implement. Have a nice Gantt chart. Everyone loves a Gantt chart of who's doing what, when, where, and how. And throughout it, we would be measuring, scoring how well we're doing against those objectives and through the different activities so that we could make changes in flight as we go. We don't just wait till the end of a project to see whether it was a success or failure. You look at the data that you've got and the activities that you're doing and what impact they're having as you go along so that you can then make improvements. And there were many times where we'd go off and do things, very communications activities and marketing, for instance, and we realized that one route of marketing, which was more cost effective, was actually more effective than another one. So we'd switch off the spend on the expensive thing that wasn't making the difference that we wanted, and we'd bang some more money into the thing which was cheaper, but much more effective in terms of reaching audiences and getting them to do the things we wanted. And you can only do that if you're evaluating and monitoring your activities as you go. So it's not rocket science, really. It is about understanding what you're trying to achieve, who you're trying to achieve it with, what the channels and tools that you have at your disposal, when you're going to do it, and then checking that it's working as you go. It's really, really simple. It's called the OASIS campaign model. I recommend everyone gets a hold of a copy from the GCS, the Government Communication Service.
Well, that's great. So anybody listening to this, do take the advice of your comms team on all of these questions, because you're more likely to be effective. That's basically the message here. I'm just going to pick up two of the things that you mentioned there, Stephen. One is about the audiences and understanding the audiences and segmenting them, which I know you do. And secondly, then about the channels, which you mentioned as well, how best to channel regulatory communication to those you're regulating. So first audiences, then the channels. Anne, do you want to pick one of those?
Yeah, the audiences are clearly very important to. You've got to know who you're talking to, and I mean, and look at their attitudes, their motivation, and the outcomes of their behaviour. But also, you need to be looking at the different types of people. As I said earlier, you've got a lot of, I think the majority of people who are law-abiding. I mean, for instance, during lockdown, it was amazing that the vast majority of people complied with rules that came out of the blue and changed everyone's behaviour. Seems a long time ago now. So you've got the willing and able, and then you've got people who are willing but need some help, perhaps to do what you want them to do. You've got the unwilling and also able. So, they don't want to do what you want them to do, but they're perfectly capable of doing it. And then, of course, you've got basically unwilling, unable, and then you've got the organised criminals which we have to deal with. So you can see all these different groups, and who you might want to target, but you maybe need to break that down even further into all the usual things about age, ethnicity, where people live, what education levels they might have had, the jobs, professions they have, their income, are they wealthy, are they poor? The more you know about the people that you're trying to get through to, the better, I think, because then, as Stephen was saying, you can tailor messages for those people so they understand that here's somebody trying to help me because I want to do the right thing. Oh, here's somebody, actually, I don't want to do that, but if I don't comply, then I'm actually going to be punished. And so it's trying to get hold of those people using the different bits of information that you have about them, because I think a lot of organisations will have information about the people and I don't mean that to sound sinister. It's just part of,
Yeah, exactly. You know who you're regulating, exactly.
Yes, exactly. So, and try and use as much information that you have without being too intrusive, I think, and making people feel uncomfortable. But getting that message that you are here to help, but at the other end of the scale, if you don't do what we want you to do, then I'm afraid there will be consequences.
Yes.
So, and if I can pick up that point about your organisation having information, you should hope your organisation knows who you're regulating and has insights. So the quality of the data informing audience insights and segmentation is really, really critical. And you can get this from your own organisation, from whatever you're gathering, but also from stakeholder feedback, from the media, from social media, and a wealth of statistics published by government and academic bodies. And one resource that I used to look at a lot, and I still do every year it comes out, is the brilliant Ofcom report into news consumption trends in the UK that shows where people are getting news information from, because that really helps you to target audiences. So if you're trying to reach, say, people in their late teens and early 20s, you're probably not going to be sourcing articles in a Daily Telegraph, because that's not what they're doing. They're not reading it. You're going to be looking at social media. And although young people still they consume BBC News more than any other source, but they don't go to it necessarily by watching the news or listening to the radio or even going to the website. They might be directed to it from something they've seen through
another source,
Facebook or Instagram or something else like that. And so having those insights really helps you to plan how to engage with people. You can also, and should, if you don't have benchmarks as to what perceptions of your organization, its competence are, you should get some stakeholder opinion polling to establish some statistically robust and reliable benchmark views. They're not that expensive, but it's really important, because then you've got something that it's grounded, that you can build on, rather than make assumptions. And if you base your understanding of audience perceptions on what you see in the media or on social media, then what you're actually going to see is a disproportionate impact from a minority of vocal politicians, media commentators, and pressure groups. And they will always drown out the silent, neutral, and supportive majority. So it's really important to get statistically significant benchmarks so that you don't go off track. Because if you base your campaigns on the minority, you're going to be
skewing the communications,
missing all of the other people who you really need to get on side.
Exactly. Brilliant. Okay, so that's really helpful to understand the importance of segmenting the audience. And I'm sure every regulator listening to this will know that there are certain groups, the unwilling, maybe the criminally inclined, that regulators spend a lot more time on than those who are willing and able and comply with the rules. And we can't forget about those in the communications. Briefly, on the channels then. So we've talked a lot about audiences and how to understand those, but just give us a bit of insight into the kinds of channels that you can use to get through to them, just kind of in a nutshell.
Well, I think things are a lot more complicated these days when you're talking about channels, because there is such a wide number that you can use. You've got the traditional TV, newspaper, magazines. Now you've got social media, but social media is fragmented into, you've got X, formerly Twitter, you've got TikTok, you've got Facebook, Instagram, all these Snapchat, all these different methods of communicating with people. And they're very age specific, I think. There's much more focus. Facebook apparently is now just for old people. And Instagram is full of influencers living in Dubai. But there's still a lot of in-between stuff as well. And the number of people reading newspapers, of course, is falling. And the demise of local media, which used to be a great place for regulators, I would say, getting messages across. And lots of people used to buy newspapers. So it's much more complicated. But the thing is, at the same time, you've got more channels. So they're there to be exploited. And if it is old people that are using Facebook, then maybe that's where you would put some of your messaging. But it's and advertising, of course, is almost a final option, I would say, because that's always going to be more expensive. And most regulatory authorities, I would suggest, are spending sort of money, public money, which maybe should be used on other things. So you have to be very careful. I think Stephen mentioned earlier the idea, people used to come and say, let's have a poster. That comes out of everyone thinking that they're an expert on communications in organisations. And so it's trying to manage their expectations about where a poster is best used or whatever. But having said that it's more complicated, it certainly gives you more opportunities to get different messages out to different people through the many, many different channels.
Fantastic. Right. Okay. So that's just skimming the surface of a very, very detailed set of issues that, again, comms professionals can advise on. But you mentioned there about disputes sometimes within organizations about channels of communications. There's another area I know where sometimes there can be contentious conversations about these issues, which is about the use of language itself, because lots of regulators naturally and perhaps understandably want to communicate the details of the rules they're responsible for implementing, but complex rules might not get read. And although we need legal terms and conditions in contracts, for example, it's not the kind of thing that people read in detail. So what's your advice, Stephen, starting with you, to regulators so they can balance clarity and effectiveness on the one hand with the thoroughness and technically correct language on the other?
Yeah, and you're right. And all regulators will have subject matter experts who are deeply, deeply ingrained in the subject. But whenever you get groups of experts, they develop their own language, and everyone in government loves an acronym. And people who are expert are comfortable with the specialist language of their profession, whether they're lawyers or accountants or whatever. The rest of us aren't. We're normal people who don't understand all of this stuff. And there will be a statutory duty by regulators to provide correct information, and some of that will be highly technical and be required by people out in the field who they are regulating to know what it is. And you provide that information, and you provide it in the way which is technically correct. Because if you're looking at the impact, say, of insecticides in agriculture, you need to know what those insecticides are and what the various chemicals are and what you can and can't use. Of course, you need that. You can't just have something generic saying, don't use bad chemicals, please, Farmer Giles. So you do need to have that stuff. But for most of us, for most things, we don't need to know what is written into either the law or the regulation. We need to know enough to be able to make the decisions that you want us to make. And it's your duty as a regulator to explain as well as inform. But you need to remove the barriers to understanding. You can't shove the burden of understanding onto your audiences to teach themselves. So there are two things you need to bear in mind as a regulator, really. What does your audience need to know, and will they understand it? So only tell them what they need to know, not everything that you know. Any important but non-essential information, point to it on your website. Tailor your messages and language to your target audience. Write in clear, simple language that everyone should be able to understand. What I used to, and I'll remember this, used to refer to at HMRC as the Mrs. Miggins test for those who remember Blackadder. Avoid using cliches and jargon. And make sure that you've got clear calls to action. If you want someone to do something, tell them what you want them to do, when you want them to do it by, and how they're going to do it. If I can just give one very brief example of this in action. We had a new tax coming into being when we were at HMRC, and the people responsible for implementing this had drafted a 4-page letter, which was technically and legally correct. It had everything that they wanted to tell everyone about it, but it was absolutely unfathomable to me as a communications director, let alone to the I think 1 million people we were going to send it to. So we took it away in comms, took out everything that we thought was non-essential, and gave them back a one-side letter that said, there are some changes that might affect you. Look over Leaf at the flowchart that we've drawn that you can then click through. You can go through and see whether this affects you. And if it does, then here's the website to go to. Any further information is at this tiny URL. We even had a tiny URL so that people didn't have to write a 2-line long URL. And the result of that, in terms of looking at what the outcomes are, was that we had many, many fewer contacts from our customers not understanding what they were being asked to do. And the result of that was that our contact centres, for our call centres handling calls, were able to focus on other activities and improve their call handling stats. So you think in terms of some simple comms, improving the way that something is written can actually then have an impact on the operational effectiveness of the organisation and on its performance in calls handling. It isn't just a bit of fluff like, let's make this look nice or sound nice. It really has a deep and can have a lasting impact on the operational effectiveness and then the reputation of the organisation for being able to do its job.
Exactly. So this comes back to the beginning about why comms is important, because it helps people to comply. Because if they understand the rules, they're more likely to comply with them. Because most people are willing and able to comply with the rules, whatever rules you're talking about. Okay, thank you. Now, we've got only a few minutes left, so I just want to touch on a couple of final issues. Anne, Stephen mentioned right at the beginning that, and just now, about the importance of reputation to the regulator and how communicating effectively is part of that. Do you have any thoughts about why comms can help regulators have a good reputation, why it's important?
Well, I think that the communication around what the organisation is there to do, what it is doing, and, and making sure that people know what's going on. Now, it may be good stuff or it may be bad stuff. The good stuff is harder to get out. That is absolutely for sure, because people are much more interested in negative activity than anything positive. But that's not to say that you don't try. what communications can't do is actually create the reputation of an organisation. I'm afraid if an organisation isn't working properly, the communication is not going to help it stop that reputation. What it can do is perhaps rebuild the reputation of an organisation if it appears to be failing at some point. Because comms has got to be based upon reality and be truthful. Because if you're found to be not telling the truth about what's happening in an organisation, that's going to lead down the wrong. You're going to go down the wrong road. So organisations mustn't think that, if we've got a good comms team, that means we will have a good reputation. The whole organisation is dependent on the whole team that's working either at a senior level or a lower level. Everybody is part of building the reputation of an organisation, but having a good comms team who are competent, can spot where things perhaps are going wrong. As Stephen said, sending out incomprehensible letters to people is one way of helping that reputation. But it is very much a team effort. But I really would like to emphasise that comms is not about spinning a line to try and establish the reputation. That is not the way to go, because you'll be found out.
No. And if I can add one of my very favourite quotes from Henry Ford that backs up everything that Anne's just said. And Henry Ford said, "You can't build your reputation on what you're going to do." And I always keep that in mind when I'm thinking about the reputation of the organisation and what is going to make a difference. It's not what we say, it's what we do. Unless we say something stupid or offensive, like Gerald Ratner did when he destroyed his company through an off-the-cuff remark about his jewellery being crap. You've got to base your reputation on the hard reality of your performance as an organisation.
Yep, exactly. Well, again, really sound advice that regulators need to be good. That's the key thing. And then you can build a reputation of the organisation because you're actually effective, and then make sure that you've got that capability to deal with crises when they arise. Right, we're nearly at the end now. Do either of you want to just say a word about internal comms? Because we haven't said anything about that. It's part of the comms landscape. So, Stephen, just a word or two about the importance of internal comms?
I'll try to keep it short because I really like internal comms. I spent probably more than half my time in HMRC on internal comms because it's really, really important that your people are your resource, and your success or failure as a regulator is down to their work and commitment. And everything starts with them. Your objectives, your narrative, your messaging. If you can't explain to staff what you're doing, you're going to have a very hard time explaining to the people you're regulating and to the public at large. A few top tips for internal comms. Tell the truth. Tell it early. Tell it often. Become the trusted source for information so that your colleagues don't need to look elsewhere for an alternative narrative. Make sure that your colleagues hear first and are kept updated about anything that affects them. Engage with uncertainty. Say what you know, even when it's incomplete, and say when you'll be able to share more. It's better to give an incomplete story than to leave a vacuum for someone else to fill. And a bit like comms as a whole, internal comms is everyone's responsibilities. Leaders and managers must visibly lead because most team members look to their team leader, not to the executive committee or the comms team. You can't outsource staff engagement to your internal comms team. And colleagues are busy, so keep it short and relevant. Don't bombard them with stuff. And for heaven's sake, leave the responsibility for structured internal comms to the comms professionals. Don't let HR or anyone else go it alone, as communication is not their core skill, and they're going to be focused on transactions rather than on messaging. And finally, you've got to think about your organization as what channels you use, because if your organization is out in the field, there's very little point in putting stuff on the intranet if they're never going to access it. So how do you reach the people who are not sitting behind a desk? They're not all white-collar workers in offices.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Okay, so a lesson there at the end on the importance of having really qualified staff in every team, HR as well, finance, And in respect of this conversation, comms teams who can communicate internally as well as understand channels and audiences and the message and keep things in simple language. Now, I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of a topic that every regulator needs to get to grips with. And I hope very much that those listening to this podcast have got something out of the wise advice that you've both given. If I could just ask you both then to give anybody listening to this any tips of places they can go to find out more. Stephen, you've already mentioned the Government Communication Service and other things. And any tips from you people can use to go somewhere else for more advice?
I actually don't know, because I thought that from the Government Communication Service website was a good place to start, and I don't think I can add anything actually.
Excellent. Well, that's fantastic. If that's a place to go. Any final words from either of you on any of the issues that we've talked about and things that you'd like just to leave our listeners with?
Well,
Stephen,
I'd just say in terms of places to go, talk to your comms team. As Anne said, many people assume they can do comms, and they can't. So go and talk to your comms team and recognise their professional expertise and respect them. And don't reinvent the wheel, because we did so much of it in government, and the Government Communication Service continues to do so. So plunder their resources, their free resources, nick everything they've got and apply what works for you, because it's really, really good. It's among the best, if not the best in the world in terms of professional communication for government and regulators.
Fantastic. Well, also the Institute of Regulation hopes to make sure that regulators can talk to each other about comms and many other issues as well. So if anybody listening can see an example from another regulator of things that's gone well, then you can obviously get in touch with them or do that via the Institute of Regulation as well. Anne, any final words from you on any of these issues that you just like to leave us with?
I think Stephen's right. Talk to the comms team and see what they've got to say, and keep them close. Make sure that the communications team is involved in everything that you do, really. I think it will help. I definitely think that communication is of major importance and becoming even more so as the world goes on.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. As all the regulatory landscapes that I'm aware of are complex with many actors, and trying to shape behaviour in a complex system is a really hard thing to do. So getting your comms right is absolutely core to good regulation. And I'm really grateful to you both for a very interesting discussion with lots of tips in there and ideas for people to follow up. So thank you, Stephen Hardwick and Anne Shevas. Thanks also to our sound engineer, Neil Bowerman from Bowerman Audio Production. I hope those of you listening have found the discussion interesting. If you have, do let your colleagues know and tune in to future episodes where we'll discuss other issues of interest to regulators. There's other material and events relevant to regulation on the website, ioregulation.org. And thanks again for listening to me, Marcial Boo at the Regulation Podcast. Good luck with your own regulatory challenges, and do stay in touch with each other and with the Institute to help UK regulation become the best it can.